Hi and welcome everyone to the official launch of the HRDD Academy launch day. We're so happy to see you here today. Thank you for joining us. I'll be your moderator for today. My name is Barbara Mendes-George and I'm a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, but I'm happy to be here today with the Fairware team at Fairware's headquarters in Amsterdam. We have a jam-packed program for you today, which you can see on the screen and access on the website. Today's program includes a welcome talk with Fairware Executive Director Alexander Konstam and Member of the European Parliament Lara Wolters, a talk show at 10:30 followed by a Q&A, a platform introduction where you can watch a demo of the HRDD Academy, and finally, 4 deep dive sessions which will delve into the key elements of HRDD and showcase how the Academy can guide you in supporting human rights. You're welcome to join us for the full day or dip in and out of the different sessions. And at the end of the day, you'll also be able to scroll back on this live stream to catch up on anything you've missed. If you have any questions, specifically about the HRDD Academy and how this would work for your specific brand, Fairware is offering one-to-one sessions today. Simply go to hrdacademy.com/launch and book your 20-minute slot through the link for a brief conversation with one of our HRDD experts. Of course, you can also contact Fairware directly by email through join@fairware.org. They will follow up with you after today's event. And throughout today, we're going to be using a tool called Slido. Its aim is to encourage audience interaction with everyone in the virtual world, and it's a great way to anonymously submit questions to our speakers today. And you can also rate the questions that you believe are the most important. You can see on the screen now, there is a QR code that you can scan, or you can go to slido.com and enter the code that you can see. So, what is the aim of today's event? To answer that question, I'd like to introduce you to Fairware's Executive Director, Alexander Konstam, who I'm currently sitting next to in the studio. Hi, Alexander.
Hi, Barbara. Great to be here. And thanks to everyone for joining. It's really, really great to have so many people join us online and here in the studio. So yeah, what are we doing today? Jam-packed, as you said, and that's also been the story of our 25 years. We've been around for 25 years now. Fairware, working on labor conditions in the garment supply chain. We're fully focused on workers in specifically this sector and have been for 25 years. And actually, throughout those 25 years, we've been working on HRDD, on Human Rights Due Diligence. It wasn't called that at the time, but meanwhile, that's what it is. And obviously, it's more than just our work. It's the law of the land in Germany, in Europe, and we'll talk about that today as well. I think why Fairware? That's a question that I would have if I were watching. Well, we're a multi-stakeholder. I think that's really important to stress. We have trade unions who were part of our founding. They're still on our board. We have the employers associations, industry, retail, both, and manufacturing. And we have labor rights NGOs as well. So we really try to combine all the interests and make the best of that. And today is about the Academy. You mentioned it. The HRDD Academy is all those 25 years of working with our stakeholders, with our member brands, in practice, in their supply chains. And we put all of that knowledge together into one online platform that helps anyone who wants to work on human rights due diligence do that the best way possible.
Indeed, and as I mentioned, we will see a demo of that coming up later today. So, Alexander, you've been leading Fairware for 6 years. Where do you feel that it can have the biggest impact in the current climate?
So I think it's about giving clarity. What can you expect from a business in the context of due diligence, of human rights due diligence specifically? So that has to do with impact. What is impactful? Also has to do with what's practical, what actually works in practice. Because nobody wants what a lot of the boardroom consultants will actually tell you, that you need to do some tick box exercise and you do this, you do that, and then abracadabra, things are finished. That's not how it works. Due diligence is about working with your partners in the supply chain, your direct business relations first and foremost, and really in a partnership with them, creating the best circumstances for good business, good working conditions, and a decent treatment of the environment. So those things together, that's much more than a paper reality. And what we're trying to do is give clarity in practice.
Wonderful. So, Alexander, what do we have coming up next on today's event?
So that's really, really important. I think we're starting maybe with the best, although you know, the rest of the program is pretty
more
good
good is
too.
to come as well. Please stay
We're also
online.
ending with the best. So no, but I'm really, really excited about our first guest, Lara Wolters. So throughout the day, we'll have guests from all kinds of different walks of life, I think they say, different constituencies, different views on due diligence. But Lara is, I would say, the member of the European Parliament who has been most instrumental in making this law happen. And not only making a law happen, but also making sure that it is a law that can work for business as well as for people and planet. I think that's very important. So great, we have Lara on board.
Fantastic. Yes, as Alexander mentioned, Lara is an MEP from the Netherlands who has been spearheading the European Sustainability Directive CSDDD, an acronym you'll be hearing a lot today. She is joining us from Strasbourg, and she is an advocate for social change. And as an MEP and rapporteur on corporate sustainability, she plays a pivotal role in shaping policies that promote sustainable practices across industries. Welcome, Lara. We're really looking forward to chatting to you today.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So to kick off, I did say that we were going to talk about this. I'm sure many of us know about this already, but could you briefly, for our audience, outline what CSDDD is and why the legislation is so important?
Yes, with pleasure. I'm just checking if you can see me okay. I can hear myself back a little bit, but first of all, thank you very much for... Okay, good. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for organizing this, for bringing all these people together who actually have to go and put due diligence in practice. That's what matters. Thanks for the very kind words of introduction, almost too kind. And yes, of course, I can say something about the importance of the legislation. I can talk about the importance of the legislation as a project, about the vision, but of course all the people attending today will know much more about how this will work out in practice, what in practice will be difficult, what will work well. So I'm very happy to hear a little bit more about that too. I think due diligence is about action, right? Due diligence is about impact, and it's about actually making a change on the ground. And that differs from other legislation and other initiatives thus far in Europe, because many of those have been either voluntary in nature or they have been about reporting and transparency. This is not about reporting as such. This is not about transparency. This is about action, and this is an obligation to proactively go and know your supply chain and to take action where there's risks or where there's negative impacts. That's different from what came before, because there was a will of so many to go and make supply chains better, to go and make working conditions for people on the ground better, but it was difficult to get that all together into a law. And so what was out there for a long time was voluntary initiatives, sector initiatives, labels. And I think that, as Alexander said, this is about clarity, right? This is about now making clear what is expected, and to help those companies that want to do well know what it is they're supposed to do. I think that many of these voluntary initiatives and many of these industry initiatives were great examples of companies wanting to do well together. But the problem is, of course, that as long as there's a small group of those who want to do well, and then there's giants who are cutting corners, those smaller ones or those companies wanting to do well aren't helped. And so this legislation is also about a level playing field. So maybe in summary, it's about action, it's about clarity, and it's about a level playing field.
Thank you. And that brings me nicely to my second question, because you mentioned obviously the giants and the smaller players. So at the moment, the legislation only applies to larger companies. So what's your advice for the small and medium-sized brands that fall outside this bracket? What is their role in this movement?
For smaller companies, we have tried to make this legislation beneficial in exactly what I said before. So making sure that those larger companies will have a tougher time in cutting corners, in extorting people on the other side of the world for wages that are not livable, for making sure that the adverse impacts aren't outsourced elsewhere without, needing to cost any of the impacts into a business model. So what we're trying to do is to give more breathing space, if you will, to the smaller players that are trying to do this. At the same time, I think that there's many smaller companies, and of course small can mean anything. I mean, when we started talking about the legislation, we also talked about actual micro enterprises, or we said, well, what is a reasonable size for a company to be able to think about this? And to think about due diligence and to take action. And some people said, well, actually, it's the smaller companies that know their supply chains much better because, of course, they are smaller. They tend to have much more direct contacts. But either way, what we said is we want those smaller companies to have more breathing space. At the same time, if they want and if they feel that they can do due diligence, then we need to give them the opportunity to do that, which is why we also talked about a voluntary system, if you will, that would make it easier for them also to transition or to grow, and to make sure that for them too, there'd be some tools available to do that, some support, etc. I think that the proof will be in the pudding, as you said. It's the very large companies that will be brought in first. We're talking 5,000 employees and over in first instance, and huge turnover. But the most important, I think, for smaller companies is in a few years to know whether they feel that responsibilities are being passed on to them unfairly. And that's something that we've tried to avoid in this piece of legislation. We've said at all costs, we need to avoid that the largest companies, that they pass on their responsibilities and their liability to smaller players down the chain, because that, of course, would mean that we're not getting the impact we want, and that would be plainly unfair. I hope that in a few years we can talk to the smaller companies and see that has worked, and if not, we'll have to take even more measures to ensure that.
May I add to that, Barbara?
Absolutely.
So I think actually we're getting most of our questions. Most of our brands are what you would probably call larger SMEs. We have some very big ones as well, and the questions are basically the same. And it's not more from the bigger ones who are under the law or going to be under the law. The SMEs are just as interested. And you're right, many of the SMEs actually do better. They know their supply chains very well. But they're also being quizzed already by their retailers, for example, or their investors, their owners, their other partners on what are you doing? Or in workwear, for example, very strong push from their clients, the big corporates or public institutions who buy the workwear from our brands. They want to know things actually beyond the law. So there is a big imperative for smaller companies as well, companies not directly liable under the first round of the law, to get their act together, and they are doing that. I would say that the more positive energy is really coming from those companies, and that's great to see. They're doing a good job. We know that from our 25 years of experience as well, that the smaller companies are actually really, really good when they get to it. So I think they will have a head start if they get ready for the law now.
That's great to hear. And in the negotiating process, I think everybody involved in this was very clear on it. I think there was this phrase that we often used with SMEs are out of scope, but we all know that they're in scope, in that we all know that those larger companies are going to be asking questions down the supply chain. They're going to be asking SMEs to give transparency on what happens in their chains. And for us, I think the point was those questions are good, and it's absolutely beneficial to all if SMEs get involved in this, or even the larger ones. But what we need to avoid, of course, is an unfair passing of the buck. And so we've tried to strike a balance there. But it's really great to hear that so many companies are doing this already. As well, because throughout this negotiating process, it was difficult sometimes to know who was speaking for SMEs. And that was something that happened all throughout the process. There's, as you might know, in Brussels, there's many associations who represent different industries. But at some point, when you've got 3-4 organizations that claim to be the voice of SMEs in Europe, or some very vocal ones from Germany, for instance, and they have conflicting views on this, it becomes quite tough. So we've tried to strike the right balance there, and that will hopefully be beneficial to all.
I think it has all the makings of that. Obviously, we are really interested in collaborating with lots of different stakeholders, also in production countries. I think that's maybe an area that we should, in our little talk show, also cover. Because obviously pushing down your responsibility as a big brand to smaller brands is something that you're trying to avoid, we're all trying to avoid, but also pushing down your responsibility to your suppliers is not what we want, right? We want people to work together. What's your view on the collaboration with the suppliers and the people in the businesses in the production countries?
Well, first off, I think that if you zoom out a little bit, if you take a wider view, which is easier maybe for you to do than for me, because I'm not a garment sector expert, but what I'm sensing at the moment is a cynicism in some of the trends that we're seeing, and that's something that I wanted to ask you about. We've been working on the assumption that the move in the garment industry is towards more transparency, more sustainability, etc. But I think what we're seeing now in recent times is with the explosion of makes like Shein and Temu and others, that there is a hardness in international trade that we weren't expecting. And so I think in this piece of legislation, we've been very focused on making sure that there's an impact on the ground. And practically what we've done is we've said companies need to make sure that their purchasing practices, for instance, are responsible, right? So that pricing and costing is at a level that ensures adequate wages, that payments are being made on time, that there's a joint planning of production, that there's not last minute modifications, etc., as we saw in COVID. So we've done that. We've said it's important that when contracts are being made with local producers, etc., that those are fair contracts, right? That there's a clear allocation of tasks, that there's no, in Dutch you say strangle contracts, that there's not an unfair transfer of obligations. But all of those things were, of course, done in the spirit of we all need to be moving towards these shared goals, because at the end of the day, this is better for everyone. Supply chains will become more robust, etc. What we're seeing now, and this is the part of zooming out a little bit, is half of the European Parliament seems to have collapsed next to me, but I don't know what that was, but I do wonder about the pressure or the effects of these huge big companies that very cynically that seem to not even pretend that things like decent incomes or come into their equation, and the effects of those on those smaller players that are trying to do all of these things. And that's something that's of huge concern to me. The good news about that is that as the European Union, we have tools to go and counter that. And I think that there's never been such a vocal push from members of Parliament and members of the European Commission to say, well, we have got to start thinking about taxing those extremely cheap garments. We've got to think about things like the extremely aggressive advertising to young people, etc. So hopefully with that, we can make a difference too in the coming years. But that is something that I think, is a push in the complete different direction than what we've been trying to do over the past years. And I'd love your views on that as well.
You're right. I mean, that's a curse. It's really a terrible direction. And we have very good European retailers who want to do a good job. And they're being undercut by this kind of cowboy behavior. So, yeah, obviously that's not in the interest of workers, not in the interest of the environment. It's also not in the interest of business in the end, only their own specific business, because it exploits the producers just as much as everybody else. And you're right, robust supply chains are a great, I would not say side effect, but a great effect of the CSDDD law if we get it right in practice. And I see that already in the supply chains of some of our member brands and people using the Academy. We have some users already pre-launch, that working with your suppliers in partnership also makes them more reliable in terms of what you get, when you get it, and also even the price you get it at. Because if you look at it on the longer term view, the business is much better for everybody. So you can make investments in labor conditions, you can make investments environmentally, you can invest in your supply chain only if you take a longer term view, and the law, I think, helps a lot in doing that. We still have some time, Barbara?
We still have time for the fourth question, absolutely.
For one question, and then you have questions from the audience.
And
that's great.
And then I'll have some further questions. So
that's great.
Obviously, Laura, with the HRDD Academy, Fairware wants to contribute to the overall knowledge and capacity building within the industry. So what's your view on how initiatives like the HRDD Academy can do to support the garment industry?
I think it's vital that there's places where brands can exchange knowledge, where they can exchange best practice, where they can help each other in the practical aspects of this legislation and generally responsible business conduct. This has to be a team effort, and the industry initiatives that are out there and initiatives like these are vital in making this work, because it's difficult, of course, for one company on its own to make a difference, to have all the information, and to be able to do everything. And as much as we've accounted for that in the legislation, I mean, what we said in the legislation is you act in a risk-based way, i.e., if you cannot do everything as a company, then you need to start with those things that are most flagrant, most harmful potentially. But of course, the more that you can collaborate with others and exchange on what is happening in particular, let's say, subsectors, particular geographical areas, what worked in practice and what didn't, the faster that the implementation of due diligence of this piece of legislation will go, but the more impactful it will be. And so I think that's extremely important. And I just want to emphasize that in all of this, it has really been about collaboration throughout. So this in the implementation phase is vital, but also in getting this legislation across the line, that would have never worked if it wasn't for all those people who were working on this already. In a sense, I was the right person in the right place at the right time, or whatever the expression is. But this would not have happened if there weren't so many people who knew that in practice it can be done, and that supply chain transparency and acting on what happens 3,000 kilometers away is not a pipe dream, but it can be done. And I think that is what convinced policymakers here. Those examples, as from your member organizations, that really helped in selling this project and saying it can be done. It's already being done, actually. There's lots of companies who are doing this, who are working together to make change, and we need to be helping those companies and coding this and what they're doing already. So just to say thank you very much for that. And really, this has been a collaborative effort. And then, of course, there's been the side of all the NGOs and all the civil society organizations that have pushed from their side. But really, those practical examples of companies putting this into practice already, that's made a huge difference here in Brussels.
Thanks. I think in maybe on the collaboration effort, just to comment, CSDDD and the obligations you have under the law are individual obligations for companies, right, Lara? But many of the things that you have to do, actually, you can only do collectively. So the Academy brings together all that information, stakeholder-validated information, to do your risk assessment. You can't get that information on your own. You don't have access to the tools that were developed to, let's say, the remedy options that you have, how to deal with risks. Those are all things that you need to crowdsource, and they're all in there. You can't do that on your own. I think that's one of the beauties of this legislation, that it allows for so much collaboration as well. And maybe a final word on that, and also on what companies need to do. I think some companies are already running towards the boardroom consultants and getting their checkbooks ready and ready to pay a lot of money to get this sign-off and this paper reality. But that's not going to work in practice. Those consultants don't know our sector. We know our sector, we, as in the companies, Fairware, our stakeholders, and we need our own knowledge, our practical knowledge, to do the best job under this law, I think. Great.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Lara.
Maybe just to add one, if I could just add one word to that, because I think Alexander said it right. At the end of the day, it is the company itself that remains responsible. And I think that the host of consultants that are being brought in, what we've done in this legislation is said, of course, there's ways of trying to do your due diligence that will involve others. And so especially in things like stakeholders and initiatives and sharing data, etc. Yes, by all means, go ahead, but it can never be a tick box to then say, and therefore we have done our due diligence correctly. There can be collaboration. There can be all kinds of things that are helpful to companies that, of course, on their own do not have all the information. But crucially, what we've done is we've also pushed back against those who said, well, as long as an accountancy firm says that the due diligence plan is fit for purpose, then things are fine. Or as long as a company is a member of some industry initiative, then we'll tick that off, and that is fine. We said, no, absolutely not. There were those who said, well, if you're part of an industry initiative, then that should be a safe haven. There was a push on that in the legislation that would basically mean that all you needed to do was get a membership somewhere. That is absolutely not the correct implementation of due diligence. You are liable and responsible as a company. But having said that, where companies cooperate in good faith and try to cooperate to do their due diligence correctly, then we applaud that, and there's space for that, let's say, in the legislation.
Thank you very much, Lara. We have 5 minutes left of our time with Lara, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we've been asking people to submit questions through Slido, and we have a few coming in. So, Lara, could I ask you, can large brands avoid the CSDDD by moving their operations elsewhere?
If they, the short answer is probably not. If they move their operations elsewhere and also stop selling into Europe, then yes. If you have a Chinese company that only sells in China, yes, it will not be covered by the CSDDD. But the spirit of this legislation is our market, our rules. And if you are selling into Europe above a certain threshold, but if you're selling into Europe and you're a large company, then you will be covered by this, and moving out won't help you. There's also a requirement that if you're above a certain threshold, you need to have a legal representative in the EU. So also you cannot just be completely absent. But bottom line, yes, you will still be covered by this unless you leave Europe completely and are not interested in doing any business in or out of Europe at all.
Good to get that confirmation from you. Another question coming through is, do you think that the HRDD Academy is a good initiative to be helpful in the effective implementation of the law?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've covered that, but yes, the more that people exchange, share their knowledge, the better. And I think that perhaps in the newness of this legislation, there can be it can be perhaps daunting for some to go and put this all into practice and know whether they've done the right thing. And I think that in that, and because this is new legislation, because it is a change in thinking and in requirements, it can probably be a comforting thing to be able to exchange with practitioners from the same sector, and an exchange on the obstacles they're finding, hopefully also on best practices and so forth. But I think we talked about it before. Initiatives like these are wonderful, and for us the reality is always the reality of negotiating rooms in Brussels and in Strasbourg, and it's so great to see that then translated into the not negotiating rooms but the meeting rooms of all those places where change actually happens.
And speaking of translation, we've translated the CSDDD, the OECD guidelines, the UNGP, it's all in that academy. So you know that you're doing it the right way. That helps too.
That does help. Thank you. If we have time for one final quick question, this I would really like to ask because I think brands would be interested to hear, Lara. Could you briefly explain what fines for HRDD non-compliance will look like?
What fines will look like?
Yes. What will happen to companies if they don't comply?
Yeah. So in this legislation, there is a test, and the test is essentially, could you or should you have known about adverse impacts? And if you could or should have known about adverse impacts in your supply chain, have you done everything in your power to counter them, to avoid them if possible, to counter them, or to to diminish them, let's say, if they're already happening, and have you compensated victims appropriately? And I think that those are very practical pieces, let's say, of the due diligence process that companies need to go and do. And what that means is that for a judge, for a company that is taken to court because a party thinks that due diligence wasn't done properly, a judge will be looking at those steps and seeing, has this company taken its due diligence duty seriously? And if not, then indeed there can be a fine, and that fine can be, for the gravest offenses, I think upward of 4 or 5% of turnover. That is a hefty fine for those multinational, multi-million dollar brands that we're talking about, of course. At the same time, that fine is there as a last resort, I would say. There's a fine there because, of course, we want this legislation to be legislation that moves away from the realm of the voluntary. So what we needed was teeth. In the ideal scenario, of course, it doesn't get to that. It's a preventative mechanism for companies to do this seriously, but in the best case, of course, it doesn't get to that because companies take this seriously and they avoid risks and human rights impacts before that stage.
Thank you for laying that out so clearly to everyone, because yes, we want people to be aware of the consequences, obviously. So thank you very much, Lara and Alexander, for joining me today. We're going to move now into our talk show section. But before we bring on the guests, I'd like to take a moment to introduce this short animated video, which briefly presents the HRDD Academy and why Fair Wear have decided to launch it. Thank you, everyone.
For decades, we've known that most people who make our clothes endure poor and unsafe working conditions. This is not fair. But change is possible, and it's already happening. Introducing Fair Wear's HRDD Academy, an online learning platform that empowers brands to work on due diligence and stay ahead of legislation. This is your go-to place for guidance on how to do business better. The HRDD Academy is built on Fair Wear's decades of experience across global garment supply chains. With 140 front-runner member brands and stakeholders, Fair Wear has provided practical solutions to ensure due diligence has a positive impact on the people who make our clothes. Through the HRDD Academy, you can access over 100 guides and tools, and more than 50 learning modules, all aligned with international standards on responsible business conduct in the garment and footwear industry. Governments are enforcing more ethical clothing. Consumers and investors are demanding it. Join the HRDD Academy today and become part of a growing community of brands committed to transforming the industry.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and you will see we now have some guests around the table because we are in the talk show section of our program. First, I'd like to summarize what we discussed with Lara and Alexander. We talked about collaboration and it not just being a tick box exercise. I think this is something that's going to come up again. We talked about how due diligence is about making a change on the ground. It's not like the voluntary initiatives or reporting focused ones. It's about action. It's about leveling the playing field to be able to make sure that small companies can keep up with the bigger companies who have been cutting corners. We discussed the role of SMEs in HRDD and how important that is. And again, I will finish by saying collaboration is key. So I'd like to welcome our guests to the talk show section, and we're bringing together representatives from Fair Wear, a brand, as well as an ethical fashion advocate to discuss why does HRDD matter. So for the next hour, I will be in discussion with our guests on everything relating to this theme. However, there will be a Q&A at the end where you are free to submit your questions at any time. As before, we'll be collecting your questions on Slido. That's an easy-to-use Q&A and polling platform to gather the best questions from the audience. You can ask questions from any device and also vote for the ones you like the most. All you need to do is go to slido.com and simply enter the code, which you should now be able to see on the screen. So before we begin the discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. On my left, Suhasini Singh leads Fair Wear's supply chain engagement work, overseeing the efforts in production countries. With deep expertise in conflict resolution and human rights, Suhasini brings a true worker-centric perspective. Thank you for joining us, Suhasini.
Thank you, Barbara, for having me here.
Thank you. On my right, we have Christian Smith, Head of Sustainability and D&I Stakeholder Engagement and Reporting at Zalando. He leads Zalando's CSRD reporting work and is focused on adapting stakeholder engagement for this brave new world. Great to meet you, Christian.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Jesse Blumendahl, on my left, is the Policy Coordinator at Fairware, making sure the organisation follows the UNGPs and OECD guidelines. He also uses his policy knowledge to support Fairware's advocacy work at both international and European levels. Welcome, Jesse.
Great to be here. Thanks.
And lastly, we are joined by Tena Lavrincic. Tena is an ethical fashion advocate and director of Fashion Revolution Belgium. As a speaker, campaigner and writer, her mission is to reshape how consumers think about clothing and responsibility. Great to have you here, Tena.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So I'd like to kick off by asking each of you around the table a big question that will guide today's programme. What does HRDD mean to you? Who wants to start?
I can start, yeah?
Please go ahead, yeah.
HRDD, I mean, for me it was, or it is rather, the fact that due diligence is centered around human rights and not due diligence for business risks or financial risks, but on human rights risks. And with the HRDD approach, I mean, the whole idea is that companies try to take steps to mitigate, prevent, and remedy adverse impact to the people in the supply chain, and not just people working for them, but also the community which is impacted because of their operations. So, yeah, and this is also an opportunity that stakeholders will be heard, and heard in a structured manner. It's not ad hoc engagement with stakeholders, but something that is part or integral part of HRDD, the way that I see. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Who wants to go next?
I can follow up from that. So,
Christian, go ahead.
I think coming from the kind of brand and retail side, it's a great way for harmonization. I mean, you mentioned there being a discrepancy between what certain brands do. Now it's very, very clear what brands need to be doing in order to fulfill their obligations to have better impact on their supply chains, but also looking from a risk perspective. And so it really does provide the right level of guidance and the right structure for there to be a much more holistic approach towards addressing human rights, and also, I would say, environmental issues as well, because for us, it's not just human rights, also environmental topics. So it's a good starting point, and I think the real key aspect to this is not just about what we do as organizations, but I'm really interested to see what enforcement looks like, because if there's no enforcement, then this is just a piece of paper that creates a lot of additional work for people. So that for me is, I think, what it means. It's new ways of working, but also enforcement by governments as well.
Exactly. This is why I wanted to ask Lara the question about the fines and compliance. What are going to be the consequences? Because that will change things. Who wants to go next?
I can say, very simply put, for me as an activist, it means industry finally taking the accountability for their own supply chains and for the way the state of the industry is right now, and stopping to shift responsibility that we've seen. It's a sort of a result of something that many of us have been advocating for decades at this point, and I see this as finally the industry and legislation, as mentioned, coming together and trying to do something finally, like a result of a long process, and we're still at the beginning of it. So yes, accountability and also a little bit of celebration as well for things that have been done.
Accountability and celebration, I like it. Yeah. Great. Yes, sir?
Yeah, well, I would like to add to what Suhasini was already saying. So for me, it is really about decent working conditions. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's also a business model in a way, making sure that your supply chains, your relationships are robust. I think especially during the pandemic, here in the office, it became clear that those who had their relationships in order, that were able to work based on their due diligence on their human rights, stayed ahead of the curve during the pandemic, but we also saw them work or go up quickly after. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's a key thing also.
And can I add to, and because you mentioned Corona, we also saw the worst phase of business during Corona. And talking about relationships, There were factories who were complaining that even after being a supplier for 30 years, the relationship was snapped just because, Corona, no one can commit anything, we cannot give a order. So it brought the worst front of businesses, and therefore I think HRDD is so much more important, because the reliability was suddenly went missing in the relationship. Yeah.
Given, we've talked a lot about collaboration, so Hasani, I have a question for you, because we've talked a lot about multi-stakeholder initiatives and collaboration. What do you think the main value of multi-stakeholder initiatives are?
The main value of multi-stakeholder initiative, I think it's because of the character of the multi-stakeholder initiatives. So they understand the business because they are part of, that is one big part of their structure. But at the same time, at least most of the MSIs, and I can say definitely for Fairway, business interest is important, but not at the cost of labor rights and human rights, because we are talking more holistically. So the role of MSIs becomes so much more important because they understand both aspects, business as well as human rights. They can be a great facilitator in bringing them together, and where risks are heard and addressed very closely and not through a wire medium. And also through the approach, it's an ongoing process which MSIs are in a position to give that ongoing engagement with business and with the stakeholders. So I see that. And then second, something that Christian told about harmonizing an aligned approach to human rights due diligence. So not each party is interpreting in their own way, but as MSIs, we can facilitate that alignment and harmonization of terms or approaches that is talked about in the law, or yeah.
Great, thank you. And that actually, unless someone has anything else to add, feeds in nicely to a question I had for Christian, because I really wanted to kind of go a bit deeper on why does HRDD matter in relation to brands and retailers like yours for their long-term success?
Yeah, I think from a Zalando perspective, we can look at it in two ways. Firstly, as a brand, we were already have to comply with the German Supply Chain Act. So we've seen firsthand the efforts that go into kind of modifying your operations in order to comply with the German Supply Chain Act legislations. So from a brand perspective, it's really helped to integrate the risk assessment process into the business in a meaningful way. It's helped us to understand where our biggest areas are, what the biggest risks are, and then tackle them. And I think that differs from traditional corporate responsibility programs in a way that we're able to really go where we can make the most impact, understand where the most risks are, rather than previously just kind of finding pet projects that gave you a good kind of shiny feeling. We're really kind of looking at, okay, so what are our biggest risks? Where do we have the leverage and ability to really dive into it? And how do we take those lessons into our organization and have that continuous improvement program? So that's from a brand side. I think from a retailer side, what that also gives us is the opportunity to really take what we've learned from that brand perspective and look at our retail partners and start to bring them on board and understand what they need to do. But we also have to understand that from our retail perspective as well, that the due diligence performance of the brands on our platform is essential for our own compliance. Mm-hmm. So therefore we have this dual role of being a brand, but also a platform where it's very important for the long-term survival of our own business, kind of to Yes's point, that these businesses stay in business and they're therefore compliant and they kind of succumb to the fines and the potential punishments. So it's really important that we as an organization see it from both sides.
Great. And how do you see the Academy fitting into Zalando's work on HRDD?
I think from a brand perspective, we're really looking into how certain things that you've developed can help enhance what we already do, and what we'd like to understand, having had a sample of it so far, is how that can help us to help our brands identify what they need to do. I think again, go to the point that there's a massive discrepancy between what certain brands doing versus others. And again, this gives us the guidance to help brands understand what HRDD actually means in practice. And I also appreciate the fact that I think Fairware is one of the few organizations that is actually officially aligned with OECD. So it gives that additional gravitas when we talk to our brand partners, for example, to say, yeah, this is actually a good way to go in order to increase your knowledge.
Thank you. So we've talked about HRDD, we've touched on CSDDD. So yes, sir, I'm going to look at you because you have a background in international trade, sustainable supply chain development, and now you're involved in policy development. So could you share a bit more about the current legislative landscape, not just HRDD and beyond?
Yeah, by all means. I think it's interesting to see it. So over the last 5 years, we've seen a quite dramatic change in the landscape in that sense. We've seen the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive come up, the CSRD, which is part of a much bigger action plan from the European Union, which is focusing on redirecting basically the money flows towards sustainable opportunities, towards sustainable business. And also making, at the same time, sure that system risks are taken out. So that's one side of the equation that's already happening. I believe Christine is already working quite hard on that. Then, over the last year, we saw the CSDDD. I'm not going into details there because I think there was a person just before me who was managing much better on this. And we've seen the product ban on forced labor. That's regulation, and it's super important because all 3 of these laws basically also will ensure that you need to do, basically they're all connected to doing your due diligence. And I think the CSDDD in that sense is your backbone in starting doing that. Of course, alongside with what the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines already have been saying around this. It's not new. We've been doing this before, already for a longer time, but now it's also something that we say as the European Union, but also as the people, let's do it formally, in law.
It's a framework providing guidance. Tenor, coming to you. So do you see a growing demand from consumers for transparency in this area? Obviously, you've been an activist for a while. How are things changing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the changes that we were just talking about are definitely seen anywhere. Fashion is a complex system. That means that if we start seeing changes in one part, like legislation, it reinforces, but it also feeds off changes in other parts as well. So definitely, I've been seeing a huge shift, especially in the last few years. So I started my sort of like sustainable fashion or ethical fashion journey about 7 or so years ago as an activist. And the types of conversations I had back then are pretty different than the types of average conversations I have right now. Like back then, there was a lot of emphasis on awareness raising. There was a lot of convincing that we need different changes. There was a lot of rejection as well. Nowadays, when I talk to people who are maybe not so much into fashion, it is assumed that there are problems. Often it is assumed. If nothing else, we see the pollution the industry brings. We all heard about ethical problems. We all heard about labor violations, etc. We all heard. It is known. It is more or less known fact. Now we are ready. Definitely a shift in conscience. We also have data that shows this. It's not just my impression. Like there are a bunch of studies easily available that show that many people are expecting transparency, for example, are even asking brands to be more transparent. There are some studies that show like up to 80% of their respondents say that. It's not just a minor number. However, those studies or similar studies also show a gap between expectations and sort of consumer values, exactly, and practice, or like the behavior, exactly, because it does not often translate. Right. And it is often said to be like a paradox, like a consumer paradox or behavioral paradox or whatever. To me, it's not a paradox at all.
No. We need to help them a little bit.
Exactly, because there are many reasons why people are not translating this. It's not because they don't care or they don't know any better. There's a lack of accessibility. There's a lack of offers. There's a lack of maybe if I want to buy something, I don't have time to research that brand. Like it should be more practical. It should be more accessible. And this is where we need brands to act up. And if that is HRDD, great. We need them to act up.
I find it interesting what you said about how it's when you have the conversations with normal people now. I've worked in sustainability for almost 15 years, and it's been interesting to see how things have shifted. And what you're saying is it isn't just the people interested in sustainable, ethical fashion, it is kind of normal people, so to speak, who are coming to you, who also know more information than before. Yeah. So how can consumers, activists, and the broader community support and encourage brands to take HRDD more seriously?
Right. That's a very good question.
A big question, I know.
Well, I mean, number one, purely as consumers, what we buy, where we buy does matter. It does translate. We do live in a society that does depend on finances, does depend on capital. So yes, where we buy and what we buy absolutely matters. If we can, we should go for those options. That is purely as consumers. We are far more than consumers. We are also parents, we are also teachers, we are also brothers, we are also, artists, we are community builders, whatever. It's important to recognize that no matter what we are, we have a role in this industry. This industry, it's not, we don't have to be all like fashionable people or whatever. We have a role in it, and it's important to recognize that, and to recognize that, okay, if we can't buy directly from brands for whatever reasons, that's all right. We can support them by engaging with them. We can support them by following them. We can support them by talking about them, spreading the word. We can also choose as consumers also to tell brands that we are not very clear about, to tell them and demand steps from them. Consumers do have impact on brands. I mean, the whole purpose of any business is to answer the consumer demand, so we can create that demand for more transparency. Importantly, we are also citizens, and we can choose to vote not necessarily with our wallet, but with our rights. We can hold the legislators accountable. We can demand better regulation. That is all sort of on an individual level, which honestly, if we stay at that individual level, it is exhausting and it's not very realistic. So the real power lies in collective. We can all gather and the more of us can demand brands to take accountability, the more of us can demand governments to think about our present and future. So joining different organizations and different networks, whether that is your local mend and repair group, so you can practice slow fashion, you can practice sort of new attitudes towards fashion. Well, it's not new, but different attitudes towards slow fashion. Or you can join different organizations like your local branch of Fashion Revolution and join the actual political and cultural movement.
Thank you, Tena. So I'd like to go back to Fairwear, Suhasini. I wanted to talk to you about Fairwear's work, production country work, because you've been involved in that for many years. So I wanted to share, how has HRDD played a role in that work? And could you maybe share some case studies of impactful HRDD implementation?
Yeah, so for Fairwear, HRDD or human rights has been central since the start. Mm-hmm. and this year we are celebrating 25 years of Fairway. So we have that many years of experience of engaging with stakeholders, giving workers' voice the primary importance and what they need, what violations they are meeting with. And this is done through, several aspects of our work, but one of the main tool is through audits and assessments. So if the same violation comes out every time, we also assess it, see if it is structural or one-off, and then learn and guide the brands in what are the suggested action that you should take. This could be a training or just giving them a good guidance document on how you should address it. And then also seeing that these things are done and are impactful. So the actions are taken, and this is done through our brand performance checks, which is this side of the work. Europe-based work. And giving a concrete example, Bangladesh is a cliched country which keep coming up in whenever we talk about garment industry. But a big example is sexual harassment in the supply chain. It was raised as an issue, a very lighter, hush-hushed issue because audits did not cover it. If you go to a worker and say, no one would say, yes, I'm a victim of sexual harassment in the supply chain while working in the factory. So this was structural. Nothing was being done about it. People were talking, or there were research papers, but no action as such. And there, together with the stakeholders, local stakeholders, we created a training module in the factory. So it was training the workers, middle management, who are often the perpetrators of these harassment, and the management. Because if the management doesn't, one, recognize that there is a problem, and second, basically say that these things are needed in order to have a healthy work environment. So the training was developed for all the 3 levels at the factory. And this was suggested to all these brand sourcing in Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. So this has been a long drawn, not a process, but long house. Yeah, you cannot eliminate sexual harassment or violence against women in just one training or 3 trainings. Mm-hmm. You have to do it continuously and monitor it. And now we also see, and together with it, we also had complaints helpline that workers could just reach out. We also did help factories set up factory-based the committees to take up complaints. So, and over these years, we have seen most of the complaints that were initially coming on the hotline is now dealt with at the factory level committee, so which is a great success because that is what we want, that complaints are addressed at the factory level. However, we still have complaint number or where workers can call if they do not trust the system at the factory level. Mm-hmm. So we have seen around 200 to 300 complaints together being in a year being resolved, sexual harassment related complaints being resolved at the factory level in Bangladesh alone. So that is a great success, and now this was Fairway doing it, but we are now, since last 2 years, we've also handed over the training to local partners and organizations that they can continue this training not just to our suppliers, but to whoever wants in the industry. Mm-hmm. And because women are there, women will continue to work, they need the job, so the industry is important, but things that are structural needs to be addressed at a more sustained level, and this is the way to do it.
Could I ask you something?
Yeah.
So it was not so much the audits where this came up, but it was really the stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, so indeed, yeah. So, Fairway, the findings that are brought up in the audit are also then triangulated through stakeholder information and talking to the worker themselves and through the document. So it's not just, of course, the audit, but it was also what the stakeholders or NGOs were talking about in the region. And
but I think it's important to stress there that it's not like it's one kind of moment in time where it might or might not pop up. But if you have a wide network of stakeholders which you frequently engage with, that's when these kind of issues, which are
more nuanced,
more tested.
I could add to that as well, because I think that's kind of the direction this risk assessment based approach leads you towards. Having worked also in the industry for over 15 years as well, there was always a slight discrepancy between what you find in your audits versus what you know to be true on the ground. Speaking to suppliers, speaking to NGOs, speaking to civil society organizations, there was this idea, well, how do you combine the two? Which is not to say that audits don't have value, but it's really important to understand that audits are a certain point in time, a very fixed point in time, that the conditions through which audits are conducted are very artificial. Even if you do something like an unplanned audit, it's still a very artificial construct. And then it means that you as a brand end up chasing the wrong thing to fix. And so this much more holistic way of gathering information, we have data systems that kind of scan the internet for information that comes through to help us understand what the risks are. If you're talking about Bangladesh, well, where in Bangladesh are you talking about? If you're talking about India, where in India are you talking about? What are the most important risks in the particular geographical areas that you need to address, and making sure that you can then allocate the right resources, whether it's budgetary or training, whatever it might be, to address those issues and start dealing with the root causes. And so this approach, this due diligence approach, really changes the emphasis of the work, but also provides an opportunity to look at things that are very specific in the areas where you operate, and then try to fix those topics rather than just relying on one particular tool that we know has its faults.
Interesting. I have a follow-up question for you, Christian, but I'm just checking, does anyone have anything else to add? No? Because my next question was going to be, which elements do you believe are most important to make a real impact on workers' lives in your supply chain?
I think I think there are several. I think, first of all, if we want to make a positive impact, there's our own behavior that we have to look at. So, which is why we also became Fair members as well. It was, we need to change our own approaches. We need to understand what are the things that we do as an organization, and how does that have an impact on our supply chain. I think this way of looking at things helps to really spread the risk across the value chain, rather than thinking that, well, the risk stops at the supply chain and then we kind of hold our hands up. No, we do contribute, and we have to acknowledge that and find the ways that we can update our own systems, our own internal mechanisms, to create purchasing practices that actually lead to better kind of terms and conditions for the suppliers that we work with. I think what we also need and have now is better information coming from the supply chain. So the risk assessments we do, again, the way that we set them through the scanning of media, the scanning of various different tools and locations, helps us to really identify what are the key elements that we need, which also, again, helps us to direct the resources in the right way. And I think the last element to this, which I'm really looking forward to engage with a lot more, is the stakeholder engagement piece. How do we then have a much more better dialogue with the people in the supply chains that are responsible for making our clothing, to really listen and understand what it is that they find important, and how we can then draw the line between us as an organization and the workers to ensure that those concerns that they have are actually being dealt with, not just on a kind of piecemeal one-by-one basis, but actually how do you formalize the structures that help you to deal with these things, so that your solutions are lasting solutions and not just a kind of plaster over a cut that eventually falls off again.
Does anyone want to add anything on stakeholder engagement?
I think it's interesting because what you mentioned is, so we're not only doing this once the violation already has happened, but really trying to do this engagement with stakeholders there before, and when we're still talking about prevention and trying to mitigate those risks.
Indeed.
And this is, I think, the core element also of human rights due diligence, and also when you unpack it, how to go about this in your identification, your risk assessment, etc.
And if I can add, so what we have seen traditionally in these pet projects, that I mean, I'm looking at Christian, but it's not it's Orlando. But companies coming up with pet projects or model village for whatever, for the CSR activity. They leave out some critical stakeholders in this whole engagement or in this pet project because they are too critical. We cannot work with them, or they keep raising problems. But they are the ones who know what's happening, what's wrong. Right. They can actually tell you this: if you work here, or on a priority basis, things would start getting better. So I think it was also, in a way, the behavior of the business so far, at least, to keep at bay these very critical organization stakeholders. Trade unions, they were often perceived to be notorious.
Kind of watchdogs.
Yeah, and so they would still engage with trade unions in the name of trade unions. But they were actually promoted by the management themselves. So yellow unions, basically. So the critical stakeholders, trade unions and civil society, are the ones who actually know what are the issues in the supply chain, what needs to be done, and brand companies should keep them close if they want to improve.
Well, then maybe I ask you, Suhasini, and you as well, Tena, how do you deal with that tension of trying to bring brands together with those critical stakeholders? How do you manage this process to try and get the brands on board to make those changes? What are you doing in your work?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that because of our multi-stakeholder character, we understand the business. Brands, we work with the brands, we guide them. But we guide them on the issues that the stakeholders bring up and what, according to them, is the right course of action or should be taken. And so for Fairway, we develop tools, we develop guidance documents, and also show what will work in the industry. So we show through our member brands, and most of our member brands have been very forthright in taking part in pilots and showing, okay, yeah, we will do it in a smaller setting. We try out tools, see what works, what doesn't work, and then bring back the learning for our own membership, surely, but also for the wider industry to know and learn. So, everyone is free to then work with those tools or guidance. So this is how we try to influence. Yeah.
How about you, Tena? Because you obviously work with brands as well.
Yes, that's right. I work with brands both personally and also through my work with different organizations that I'm part of. Personally, if I want to work with a brand, I will always try to see who they talk to and how much do they know about their own supply chain. Now, I do usually go for smaller brands, so there's usually advantage and disadvantage in that. Disadvantage, the fact that they do not have as much power in their own supply chain, and we have to recognize that some brands have less powers than the others. And the advantage of that is that they usually are keeping their production as close as possible to them. They can literally walk and see, people who make their clothes, which is obviously a huge advantage. But I always insist that they can show me how their clothes are made. And you can tell right away how much they know. I think more brands want to know more. For many of them, there's a lot of unclear. There's a lot of opaqueness going on. But I do usually work with smaller brands. So I think that it's a different dynamic. And then as Fashion Revolution, for example, we do publish every year our transparency index, where we are ranking brands, the world's biggest 200 or so brands in the industry, where we are ranking them on how transparent they are, how much they can actually publicly say about their supply chain. Good news is that since we are doing this, we've seen an increase in transparency. So that's good news. I think all these pressures that we're putting on them is working out. Obviously, there's still a long way to go, but we also see this as a tool to put pressure on brands as well. We are ranking them very, very publicly.
I'm going to come to you because we've talked about a lot of different stakeholders and brands, but what role do stakeholders like investors, regulators, NGOs play in encouraging or enforcing HRDD compliance, in your view?
Let me jump straight to the investors. I think they are critical. We already discussed the CSRD, and they are also being pushed towards doing partly their due diligence to make sure that the brands that they invest in are also driving that sustainability that we all wanted, and also the human rights that we foresee in our supply chain for sure, but also in other sectors. I think here it's key that they focus on this, and also that if they invest in the likes of Zalando, but also other brands that we see here, Soet Supply, Schijvens, it's key that they really add those performance indicators where sustainability is key, and also that it's beneficial to retailers, brands, to invest in this. So I think that's a very strong motivator for me, and also what excites me about the CSRD. So not the filling in, but the end result there is very exciting. And also where the CSDDD kicks in again, and where human rights due diligence, the actual doing, the backbone of it is key. I think Suhasini couldn't tell it better around NGOs and what they do. They provide that meaningful stakeholder engagement. And not only in the first step, so in the prevention part, but throughout. You're basically constantly checking in. And this is perhaps a weakness of the CSDDD, but the OECD guidelines are very clear on this, where you need to chip in, where you need to check in with stakeholders, NGOs, but also independent representative trade unions, which are key in this whole environment, I feel.
That was going to be my next question. Are there any other stakeholders that we haven't yet mentioned that you think are important? We mentioned trade unions briefly, and even regulators, yeah. Anyone else who can help with HRDD compliance?
Well, the regulator in the end, so they're currently building it up, so it's a bit hard to say where that will go to, but it's of course like, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So the better it's regulated, the more we can do around it. But we have to see. That's now being built. We're having to wait. This is all national levels. So that's maybe a challenge also. But yeah, I think also in an exciting moment there to see like, okay, how will that move forward? Yeah.
If I may, just to kind of jump on the statement you made about investors, I think it's also important that organizations like yours are able to speak to those investors to say, okay, well, this is actually what the difference is between a company that does this well versus a company that doesn't. I feel that in the last years, if you are a company that wants to invest in this space, you basically create a bit of a halo effect for other companies that don't do anything at all, and you are kind of punished for it, for the better behavior. We as a private label business have been doing some really interesting work in this space for a while, but I think that it's really important for us to then understand what is that differentiating factor. How do you as investors get to make decisions that puts your money into the companies that will give you long-term value, rather than kind of having this as a thing that you ask for, and then when it comes to making decisions, you kind of cast it aside, and then you look purely at the financial figures. So this 360-degree perspective of a company should become much more important as an investor to reward people that are doing this in the right way. As we said, the people who know their supply chains, who understand their partners better, are the people that perform better. We have the anecdotal evidence that as you improve on human rights performance in your factories, you do have increased productivity. You have workers that stay longer, which means that your garments are better as well. I mean, there are direct correlations that maybe we need to have much more of a kind of systemic study about. But I think these even as anecdotal evidence are also worth putting forward, so people do understand it's not just about doing the right thing from a kind of human rights moral perspective, but the business benefits actually are very clear for everyone who is willing to put their efforts in the right space.
Yeah, and I think also there it's important that if you go to the bank, let's say, change doesn't happen overnight, especially not in supply chains. So making clear arrangements with the bank, okay, I will not pay overnight a living wage. This is a long-term process that is really difficult to realize. I need to work together with other brands, with retailers, the supplier itself. Hence, I need time. But also, if you give me good performance indicators there, that I get rewarded on that. So I think investors there play a key role.
Great, thank you. I wanted to come back to you, Christian, to talk about the retail landscape, because you're head of sustainability. It's a very particular role. How relevant is the topic of HRDD, and how does it differ from traditional CSR initiatives? So obviously, Lara in the morning mentioned that normally it's been voluntary or very focused on reporting. HRDD is different, but yeah, you've already talked about how you see it, but how has this changed conversations that you're having within your company and with external stakeholders?
If I actually start with CSRD, because I think it's there. And
we must.
And I'm working on it already quite in depth. I think what it shows is that through all the different process, beginning with your double materiality assessment, it really helps you to understand, so what are the key sustainability-related issues that we need to address as an organization. There is no opt-out. Beforehand, you could take your CSR report and pick and choose what were the things that you wanted to report on. There is no pick and choosing now. The level of transparency is really at another level. It's pretty intense, but I think it also, again, provides that level of harmonization to say that, okay, as a company, as a fashion company, these are the things that you are mandated to report on, and it kind of offers you that template, which isn't just a 1 year template. This is it. These are the things that we have to do. So that's a starting point. Again, I mentioned that the HRDD element, starting with a risk assessment, also means that you're not just cherry picking again. You're really looking at where are the key areas. And so that helps you to start really talking to your businesses as well and having good conversations, meaningful conversations about where are we sourcing, what is our plan for that particular area, and how do we want to address some of the most fundamental issues. It also helps us with a conversation we can then have with you as a Fairwear brand as well, to say, well, if we want to stay here, in this period of time, what are some of the things that we need to be addressing in order to meet not just our due diligence obligations, but also we don't do this just because it's a legal requirement. We've been doing this beforehand, and we will continue doing this because also we feel that it is the right thing to do. We have a pretty ambitious sustainability program, and this helps us to really align from a business perspective as well with other business units to all move in the same direction. So I think the main difference is really the opportunity to integrate both human rights and environmental due diligence into our organization at a much deeper level, and to bring people along with us. The kind of compliance stick is something that we can use and we do leverage, but actually what we're seeing is that it's you kind of use that compliance tool to bring people into the conversation, and then realize that a lot of different teams were already doing something in this space anyway. So then it gives you the opportunity to really bring it in under one umbrella, and to ensure that you can then talk to different business units and ensure that they are contributing to the overarching goal that we're all trying to reach.
Great, thank you. CSRD, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the process, because I think probably a lot of our audience who are watching, they might be at the beginning of their CSRD, their HRDD journey. I myself have worked with a company who wrote their first CSRD aligned report, and it was a tough exercise. I know how challenging it can be to coordinate that data collection and manage the process. So how do you take on this challenge at Zalando, especially given that, firstly, you're both a brand and a retailer, and secondly, as head of sustainability, you have to manage the specialized team, but then, like you say, get all business units involved. What's your approach?
I'll touch that in that second, but just so my colleague doesn't get annoyed with me, I do stakeholder engagement and reporting, and so I can see my colleague is going, no, but I'm head of sustainability. So I'm looking specifically at stakeholder engagement and reporting, and I think that I'm not a reporting specialist, so I kind of put my hand up to support this, not knowing exactly what I was getting myself into. I don't think any of us do. But I think what we've learned throughout the process is that it's going to take time. We publish our first CSRD report in March next year for 2024 data. We've been working on this now solidly probably for about 18 months or so. So we started early as an organization. We were lucky enough to have people who were very much on top of the regulatory space. And so I guess there's three things I would say to this. Firstly is take your double materiality assessment seriously. That will give you the crux of what you will need to report on moving forward. The second aspect is it's okay to focus on compliance. If you try to do more than that in a short period of time, you'll get tangled up in lots of different things. And then thirdly, once you are compliant, then you can start looking at the strategic implications. I know it's a little bit back to front, but with the limited time that we have to actually implement the legislation going forward, I think the compliance piece is really important. But what I've also found is that as you're doing the compliance piece, lots of things actually come up that you didn't foresee. You know, there are conversations that we're having now that I was not equipped to have just after the double materiality assessment was sorted out. And it gives you the time to say, okay, let's comply. Let's make sure that we can pass our audit, which is also the key element of this. And then let's figure out how, as an organization, we can really take this as a starting point for a new way of reporting, and how do we then integrate it into the way the company is structured. So it provides, it's a massive challenge, obviously. I mean, there's a ridiculous amount of data points that we have to provide, but it does also provide you an opportunity, and with every passing moment, you kind of start to see what that opportunity is.
I think what I've heard, and I wonder if you all agree, it's kind of progress, not perfection, right? I think brands often are too panicked that they have to report on everything transparency immediately, otherwise, the EU is going to come for them. But as long as you start thinking about it and writing about it, even if it's just to say, we don't have anything on this yet, but it will come soon, that is better than saying nothing.
Yeah, I think it's a very new way as well. I think there's a kind of being naked when it comes to this, because nobody has ever done this before, so you don't know how people are going to react to it. We're kind of sitting there and I'm thinking, what a fashion revolution going to do with this information when it comes out. But we also have to understand that we are all in a very similar position, and because this information has to be audited, there will be a certain level of verification that goes with the information. So at least when it goes out into the public, it's information that we know to be true. And right now, at this point in time, that's the least you can ask for, is that at least when people publish something, it's verified, it's true. And then we can set ourselves up for that continuous improvement process as we further develop.
May I
of course.
Ask a question? So I think you said 18 months, right, for starting with the CSRD reporting. More or less at the same time you became a Fairware member, so working on your human rights due diligence. How did that help you then in the reporting?
Again, if I go back to the Supply Chain Act process, I think the Supply Chain Act process has been really good in turning our organization to be ready for CSDDD. Right. And so a lot of these things, the frameworks were already there. What has been really useful is kind of seeing where things are going, and then seeing what kind of partnerships do we have in order to get to where we need to go based on the new strategic direction we have as an organization. And that's where the Fairware Foundation membership really came to the fore. So if we want to really tackle our own, practices, if we want to really tackle some of the fundamental issues that we see from a risk perspective in our supply chains, then it was very clear that Fairware was an organization that could help us do that, and that could also give us the level of credibility that we need as well to go into certain areas where we know that we can have an impact. So it's not directly linked, but there's definitely a kind of parallel conversation that was taking place as we were doing the CSRD work, but also building our new strategy as well.
So just to let you know, we have about 7 minutes left of this discussion. There are lots of questions coming in on Slido, so thank you everyone. Do keep submitting them. I will be reading some out very soon. But I'll maybe ask a few more questions. To go in a bit deeper to HRDD, so Suhasini, when Fairware talks about its approach to HRDD, it says that social dialogue and freedom of association are the most effective ways to create sustainable improvements in working conditions. So could you expand on why this is the case?
Yes. So in the supply chain, workers are the right holders. I mean, all the other parties are stakeholders indeed, rightfully. But the right holders are workers, and they're also the ones with least resource, least power. We talk about power imbalance in the supply chain, brand versus the supply chain, and in that whole supply chain, workers are with the least power. Least powerful. So they will gain power only when they are organized, and the organizing should be organic. They should be free to organize, and not management saying you form a trade union or whatever, register a trade union. So that is one. So then they'll gain power, because for one worker to raise a voice, either it is individual complaint or for a collective, for a group, they are very vulnerable. They do not want to lose their job, because it's also their livelihood. So once they are organized, they can then enter into dialogue with the management, and that is what social dialogue is all about. This dialogue between management and worker representatives. So they are best placed to identify what are the violations or problems that they are facing, and they can best represent their own interest in terms of what would they need first to be addressed. And then second, and then things that are structural, they can also work together with the factory management to talk out a plan. These are the timelines, this is what we need, and if you do this, from their knowledge, and then management can come in with what they can offer. So discussion is key. The dialogue between worker representatives and management is key. However, we should also acknowledge as an industry that trade unions are not the norm in the country, especially in the southern countries. So there, as brand, one, you should acknowledge that. And second, you have to make an effort to engage with worker representatives. Even there are a few provisions in the law that talks about works committee. So which is not a trade union in its truest sense, but a committee that is democratically formed by workers. And that committee then represents the interest of the workers when they are in discussion with the management. So they are the best. No one can represent them best other than themselves, surely. And in the absence, then there, committees or, but it should be democratically elected. Again, there are also scenarios or countries where even these things are very restricted or limited. In that case, we should, as business or someone who's part of the supply chain, should engage with stakeholders who are active in the industry. So labor rights organizations, other research organizations that are very closely studying the behavior and the industry pattern, exploitation or violations that workers are meeting with. So yeah, different approaches.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to take this opportunity to say that you will be back on the program later at 2:30, because you're going to be running the meaningful stakeholder engagement.
Do listen in.
For more on this, tune in at 2:30. Tanner, I want to come to you because I work in communications and so do you, and you're a social media expert. So I wanted to ask, what role do you think tools like social media can play in making clothing fairer? And are there any other communications tools or strategies that you would recommend to brands in the garment and footwear sector to best communicate about how they're implementing HRDD?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Generally, communication is the key. If you want to let your current and future customers know what you're doing, because you're also doing this because there's a demand, hopefully. So definitely, communication generally is the key, and social media in that aspect is one of the main communication channels you can have today. It is we are past the era where it was just a minor communication channel for many consumers and for many activists like me. I will first go on your social media and check what you're doing and will look for traces on it. Then I will maybe go to your website if I like what you're saying on social media. And many people will do that. It's a first stop. It's your first front. For many brands, it's the first front to consumers today. So I always, whenever I'm working with a brand, I always tell them to take it seriously. If there's one communication channel you need to invest that is facing consumers, obviously it should be social media. I also think that social media definitely helped us a lot in organizing, especially during pandemic and after pandemic. As civil society, we definitely organized, we definitely connected better. It definitely helped fund some local organizations and local networks that could discuss these things. So there's a huge power in that. And I invite brands to be a part of that. I don't think there's a lot of point in being like us versus brands. Like, anything that brands do is evil. No, we want to see the good side that you're doing, but we also want you to be truly a part of the community as well. There's no business isolated from the community, wherever that community may be. But I also think that communicating about what you're doing should be, again, transparent. A lot of us are very used to greenwashing, and we can detect greenwashing or ethical washing, whatever you want to call it, very, very, very quickly. Again, consumers are now more informed than we might have used to be. It should be transparent and should be authentic to you. So, again, what we started with, process over perfection, like progress over perfection, is absolutely what consumers expect now. We don't need you to have all the answers. And if I may recommend any tool, I think more of us crave also less advertisement, less just like you telling us, but more genuine conversations. And I find tools like newsletters to be perfect for it, because there you can get intimate with your consumers, you can tell stories, and this is what we want to know. We want to know also the stories behind the clothes that we're buying.
Before I switch to the audience, given that we started on legislation, I'd like to finish on legislation with you. Yes.
Great.
Could you talk a bit more about Fair Wear's advocacy work and its approach to policy engagement, and then kind of a bit more on how legislation can support the brands that you work with?
Yeah, definitely. So I think early on, when the CSDD was presented by the European Commission then, we were in favor. We already had a position in favor of having due diligence legislation in place, because we saw that this could be a driving factor for our industry. So we could get started right from the get-go. What is for me interesting there was that at first we were talking to many of the the politicians, MEPs, that were in favor of doing this due diligence, but there were also a lot of MEPs that were expressing doubts. I think what really helped us is taking along our member brands as Fair Wear and really having a one-to-one conversation with the brand involved about, okay, what is it that we do when we talk about due diligence, when we talk about human rights due diligence, specifically how Fair Wear is helping us in making it manageable and also what it delivers to us. I think that was for, I'm not going to say it worked for all, but I think it did help in making the nuance more explicit and clear to them, and also getting, well, in the end, the majority that we needed. I don't think we did that. It's, of course, a thing that...
collaboration is key. Yes.
Collaboration is key, but also Lara Wolters in driving this agenda is, of course, key, not us.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone, for this initial discussion. I now see the questions from Slido. So just to explain how it works, people submit questions and people vote for the ones they like the most. So I have kind of in order the most popular questions that people ask. Some asking a specific person, some it's open. Most of them are open, actually, and I'll start with one of those. So how are you going to bridge the gap from legislation and initiatives such as the HRDD Academy to make a real impact on workers' lives, considering how ubiquitous ultra-fast fashion has become? A mouthful.
Yeah. Big one.
Yeah. The question is, of course, like, because now we're talking about the Sheins, the Temus, etc. That's the ultra fast fashion, and we do see a tendency of larger brands now having to follow suit in order to kind of stay in the game. And I think that's a big risk. I think Lara Wolters already pointed that out quite well. But it's also a question like ideally they would need to step up also in this game of doing due diligence. So we're not like, especially since they're a large business, they should be joining in this conversation. At the same time, we also see that there's challenges there. So it's a question of whether we, as an HRDD Academy, so we are providing to brands how to implement due diligence well, but there needs to be an incentive. You need to want to do it in the end. And that's, I think, the first thing that you need to get started. And especially when it comes to ultra-fast fashion, at one point, if they don't want to, then regulation is the next step. But that's not up to me.
And I would just add to that as well to say that, we talk about the level playing field, and the playing field is obviously clearly not level. And so while we as European-based retailers and brands, are kind of in a space where we have to do this, it's very unfair, and that there's certain places that still sell a large amount of products into the European economy are exempt from these legislations. So I think it's really important that the legislators sit down and understand what they can do to ensure that there is actually a level playing field, and so that these players do have to succumb to the same rules as we do.
Can I also come in? And I think a lot is also, through the Academy, we are trying to educate the brands. And education is important on what HRDD is, how should you, what is risk-based approach. That is key, educating consumers that you've been talking about. But also from where I come from, I also see educating the suppliers. Because they are sandwiched between what brands demand and keep pushing the responsibility, and then where workers go volatile with their demands and needs are not met, or they are not in dialogue with the management, then the whole industry disrupts. So capacitating the suppliers and business associations in the countries becomes so much more important, that they are sitting with the brand and negotiating at par. And only if they can do things right when they are paid a better price for the order. And if the negotiation is for every cent, then even as a supplier or manufacturer, they will try to cut corners, not give social security, not provide crash. These some examples. But if they get a better price, if they're capacitated, do a good negotiation, and then they can, hopefully the things will percolate down the supply chain. So educating that big segment of the supply chain is very important as well.
Thank you. Anything else to add before I move to the next question?
No, for me, it just shows that things like the CSDDD is just a first step. It's a huge leap. We've been fighting, as I said at the beginning, for decades for things like this, but it is far from over. So yeah, as civil society, we keep on demanding better legislation.
Great, thank you. So the second question, which I can partially answer myself, which is, does the HRDD Academy offer practical tools to implement the HRDD? Can you give an example? So we do have a demo of it coming up after lunch. But especially from Fairware, Suhasini, and yes, if there's anything you want to add to that question.
Yeah. Shall I? So the Academy shows how there is based approach. You can do HRDD with keeping workers' voice in the center, following the risk-based approach. You can see some real-time examples how Fairware has collected data, what is in there, what actions need to be done. I'm just making it up, but if a risk is shown, and then there are suggested actions as well. So those, there are real-time examples that the Academy offers. If brands are very convinced, then they can also become a member. I'm not selling the membership, but then there'll be better guidance and more, the stronger relationship with Fairware and the brands to take them through the journey. But Academy is a good place to start.
Definitely. I think what I like about the Academy itself is that at first it's about understanding what human rights due diligence is. So really going through the step-by-step approach of due diligence and see how it links to human rights and how you can provide for decent working conditions. And then in the next step, it's about the practicality of it. So unpacking, what does it mean, step one in this due diligence sequence. So what do I need to do for preventing mitigation of risks? What are the different steps that I need to follow? How do I do a risk assessment? What are the criteria around it? What should I do when visiting a factory? How can you have conversations, meaningful stakeholder conversations? And I think this is what we've tried to build, is to kind of build it up in a pace where it's manageable also for brands to follow suit. The big risk, I've seen it in the past. I've been a brand liaison myself. I would just toss a brand the OECD guidelines and say, here, this is your Bible from now on.
Bye, good luck.
But it's quite a lot to take in. And I think the important thing here is to break it down into pieces and make sure that they understand each step of the way.
I think that's generally very good advice because, we've talked about all this different legislation and how much it's demanding of brands. Slowly, surely, progress is the way. I will just emphasise again, so shortly after lunch at 1 p.m, I'll be joined by Mariette van Amstel from Fairware, and we'll go much deeper into the HRDD Academy, why Fairware have decided to launch it now and how it works, and we'll have that demo video. So hang around. The third question I have is, and I think I'll direct it at you, Christian, are buyers aware about their impact and how could brands communicate about their HRDD efforts best, I imagine?
Are buyers aware of their impact? I think increasingly. I don't think that was always the case. And here I'm using my kind of 15, 16 years of experience when I speak here. But to your point about consumers getting much more informed about the topic, buyers are also consumers. And I think there's just a general trend of salience on the topic each year. So I think there's now an understanding of, okay, then as a person, I have an impact, but then as a buyer, this is my impact. And then this is how I can also modify my behavior to reduce that impact. And that's where the purchasing practices work is really important, because that's where we can really talk about, okay, so these are your behaviors and these are things that you can do to change the way that you then have an impact on your supply base. So I think we're getting there. It takes time, and as part of the kind of overarching apparatus that we're now in, it's not something that we can also fall back on. It really is much more about how do we do this effectively. And to the communications part, I mean, that's something that we're constantly talking to our comms team about as well. I think as an organization, we obviously only want to talk about things when they're done. But I think we're also in a space now where the communication on progress is also a really important dynamic. And that's something that we need to try to find a way to get comfortable with, because we're not going to solve everything at once. But in terms of the collaborative aspects, in terms of the due diligence approaches, in terms of how we see ourselves as a retailer and a brand, you know, finding ways to communicate effectively to our brand partners, to, you know, the investors and other people is really important to ensure that people understand the direction that we're taking and that we're serious about it. So we do have to find ways to do that. And I think just based on some of the comments that have been made, what we're also find now is after the UCPD, so the consumer protection law that came out, we also see brands kind of retrenching and not wanting to talk about these topics because of the fear of legislation. And again, I understand why there is now greenwashing legislation. I get it. But I also wish that when those decisions were being made, there'd been much more dialogue between the commission and the brands involved to kind of talk about how to actually implement this in a correct way. But now the legislation is there, we also see a differentiation between how it's enforced. Again, look at the enforcement piece, which is really important, because if you are a larger organization, you generally have a target on your back, and lots of the smaller organizations kind of go ahead and just keep on doing what they were doing anyway. So I think it's really important that we do figure out how do we take this new communications landscape, find ways to talk about things effectively. And part of that is also looking at things like transparency and traceability, how we get better data through the supply chain, because that will help us create those verifiable communications. So it's a very difficult landscape to navigate at the moment, but we're trying to figure it out.
I want to come to you, Ten, a bit before I do. I think it's really important that you mentioned communicating progress, because I've worked in sustainability communications for also around 15 years. And there's a very good guide from a communications agency called Radley Elder on sustainability communications. And one of the main tips that they give for good sustainability communications to avoid greenwashing is talk about the future, and not just in, we want to be here in the future, but what does that future look like, and what role will your company play in that? Too often, sustainability communications is too general. So I think the fact that you're really thinking about it is very important, and I think consumers, other stakeholders will appreciate that you're taking that angle in talking about it. Yeah.
100%. No, absolutely what you just said, Barbara. We want more information. I think there's always this sort of a fear or a false idea, I would say, that one would overwhelm people with information. No, we want more information. But it's also, I think, what I always appreciate, and what a lot of us always appreciate, is definitely seeing the progress, but also seeing like concrete steps that you're taking next, and definitely being as concrete as possible. And the fact, I do see actually a progress in how brands are communicating. Big brands, small brands, absolutely. And that is fantastic. I think it's a part of this larger change that we're all speaking about. So I'm absolutely all pro communication.
And I'll say one final thing on this, because I could go on forever. But I think what's also shifted as well is that traditionally brands are so scared to communicate their challenges and their difficulties. And actually consumers really appreciate when you do, even if it can be in a way that it's like, okay, we had this target, we didn't meet it, this is why, this is what we're doing. And so many brands, I mean, I work not just in the garment sector, but they're so scared of their competitors and what they're doing. And if they're saying less, then you can say less. And it can be very difficult to convince them that, no, believe me, for consumers, it is, people prefer, that level of transparency than obviously obfuscation. So, yeah. But yes, don't get me started on greenwashing, because I will be here all day and it's not my event. Another question, and I'll direct this to the Fairwear side. HRDD is a rather new concept for a lot of brands. What is your advice on how to start working on it, beyond, of course, looking at the HRDD Academy? Yeah.
Well,
if they're at the beginning of their journey.
Yeah. I think there's, so besides the HRDD Academy, which I think does help you a lot. There's a lot of information around due diligence in general, but also what does it mean to do human rights due diligence. So reading the UN guiding principles and what they say about human rights due diligence and how the ideas of late Professor Ruggie are now implemented also into the OECD guidelines is very interesting, especially from a policy perspective, of course. But I think the tricky thing, what I've noticed there, and what I also tried to show with, like, I showed them the guidelines, and then what? That's often the question, because they don't have the time, nor the energy sometimes to really go in depth on these guidelines. And what you need is somebody helping you, taking you by the hand on saying, okay, these are the steps that you need to take. Of course, there's more more initiatives that can help you, but I think it is MSIs like Fairware that need to get started, or that need to kickstart basically the journey of brands here. And that's also the idea of the CSDDD in that sense, is that no, you should not do this on your own. Collaboration is key, so make sure that you exchange, that there's sectoral engagement in that sense. In the Netherlands, we've done this, we have a rich tradition in this, but it's not a given in other European countries. So make sure you find your peers, and also make sure that you get started. And for example, Zalando, by being the retailer, the platform, that's also maybe a point where you say, okay, we need this from you. And we engage with Fairware. We know how this information works, and get started. So it's more of a referral point in that sense. But there's many points of information to start.
Can I add to that? So going a bit concretely, I would say that brands need to, one, understand where their supply chain goes, how far does it go, in how many countries. The longer the tail, the higher the risk, the longer the supply chain. So make your supply chain concise. So that should be the starting point. And transparency, exactly. And then understand the risk that comes with those supply chain in different countries, the regions, workforce, and then invest in relationship, the buyer-supplier relationship. And that, if you do that, then even buyers, the first year I'm talking about, but it will percolate down, will be more confident in working towards remediating a risk and investing in it, because they know that there is a commitment or there is a stronger relationship with this buyer. So invest in the relationship, and then it'll go a long way down in remediating risks. Like first, like very prioritized, very important risks, but also later structural and things that doesn't often come out in assessments. So I would say that is key.
And it's also a matter of continuous improvement. You don't need to have all the information at once.
Exactly. Yeah. That's definitely a theme. I mean, you've already shared a little bit, but Christian, how did you start working? What was the beginning of your journey, and what has been the most effective tools to help you on that journey?
I wasn't there at the beginning because we were, as I said, we were doing the Supply Chain Act. But what I see has really had an impact is the risk assessment. It's helping people to understand what is happening, where it's happening, and therefore what are the things that we need to target. So once you have that level of salience, it then gives you something solid that you can think, okay, so these are 6 steps of the OECD due diligence process. If I'm finding this, then okay, let's start to kind of align each step with the things that I've found. And then to Suhasini's point, it's that relationship with your suppliers. So obviously from a private labels perspective, how do we work with our private label suppliers to ensure things happen? But obviously when we look at the Supply Chain Act, we're not just looking at it from that, we're also looking at it from logistics and warehouses, brands that we have on our platform as well are service providers from lots of different parts of the business that we operate. So making sure that there's really that element of, okay, this is what we know. These are the different business units that are affected by those issues, and then making sure that each unit actually understands what it is that they need to address as a kind of priority, and we go from there.
Thank you. So we have around 5 minutes left. We still have questions coming in on Slido. The next one, suppliers may suffer from audit fatigue. So how should a brand collect information in their supply chain without increasing the audit fatigue? Any tips around the table?
I mean, I can start off just to say I understand that, and prior life I worked for an organization called SLCP, which was really trying to address the audit fatigue question. I think looking at this way of working now, when you're starting from a risk assessment, but you're also looking to bring in information from other areas, it really puts the importance of an audit into perspective. And so I don't think brands should be concerned anymore about whether they run their own audit or whether they simply ask their facilities, their factories, for existing audit data from an audit that was recently conducted. I think that is one of the first things that you can do. Have an understanding of the different audit methodologies that exist, go through those methodologies and pick the right ones for you. So you might not think every audit gives you the same information the same way. Okay, fine, we'll pick one that fits. So then you can turn around to your suppliers and say, okay, well, we take these 4 different types of audit systems. If you've conducted an audit within the last 6 months using one of these systems, let us have it, we'll take a look. And if anything is flagged, we can then take a further look at that point. That allows you then to really focus on granular topics, because if you've got your audit information, you've got your risk assessment, and what you're trying to do is figure out how much do they correlate? You know, what are the gaps? And if there is a gap, then you reserve the right to then go in and do a very specific assessment, looking at a very specific topic, and making sure that you're dealing with that. So you're not just conducting yet another 2-3 day audit process, but actually you're doing something that's very much refined. And I think that's something that the factories will appreciate. The much more targeted approach that allows you to then show your understanding of their issues, but also show your dedication to solving particular issues rather than holding the factory, complicit for every single, non-compliance that it has. I think that does change the dynamic of that relationship quite fundamentally.
Interesting.
Yeah, I have this itch to say something towards the last minute.
Please go. Yeah.
I also see that if companies start engaging with stakeholders meaningfully, then audits will be redundant. And it can still be a means to monitor things that are going on in the supply chain. But the value that the brand gets from audits may not be as much if they start engaging with stakeholders. And then engagement with stakeholders, not to overwhelm them, while the responsibility of engaging with stakeholders is individual responsibility, individual brands, it should be done collectively. And yeah, if the industry comes together to engage, to hear what the stakeholders have to say, then they get data, real data, validated information, and then the need for audit may not be as much. So that will be I think it'll be a short way of reducing the audit.
Yeah.
Let buyers let suppliers do the work, and you are getting the information from the stakeholders themselves.
This links also back to the social dialogue and freedom of association that we had discussed earlier.
Right. I think we have one final question, and I think it's for you, Tanner, but I think it can be open up to everyone. How can we make consumers aware that it is people who produce their garments? How to balance between personal responsibility and projected responsibility?
Oh. That's a really good one.
Yeah.
I am somebody who always likes to, for that reason, I like to emphasize on stories more than data in wherever I communicate and whichever brands I work with. Like, sure, data is cool to know, but stories come first. And this is where sometimes you really need to rethink your communications. And this is where tools like social media can be really cool because you can actually show literally the process of making clothes. It is something that we at Fashion Revolution love doing as well. We often hold workshops where we are not just teaching people how to do their own clothes, mend their own clothes, but also challenge them to do that, to realize that it's a full process and that there are no machines that just magically produce our clothes. So, kind of experiencing yourself, but also we ask to share the actual stories rather than statistics. I also think that a lot of numbers, when you throw into people lots of numbers, it creates the opposite effect. It creates a paralysis almost. When you realize like how many thousands of people in supply chains, are underpaid and cannot afford like the basic food, like it is scary. Like it is. We cannot exactly. Yeah. We cannot solve that just like that. But what we can is start caring about those clothes, start caring about like people that we have direct link to, direct like access to. We can, there are many things that we can start. So I think like bridging that sort of gap between between the reality and personal responsibility, storytelling absolutely plays the key. And then finally, consumers are absolutely important, absolutely, drive the industry, but we have to recognize, and this goes back to what I was saying, that we are far more than consumers. We can organize as well as collective, and we can work on changing sort of our culture towards clothes, that we don't only value what's, quantities, and that we don't only value fast and shiny and new, but we also value clothes in different ways. We value high quality clothes, both in how they were produced, but also the end product. We also value the efforts that are being done behind the scenes. We value clothes by mending them, by repairing them, etc., etc. So personal responsibility kind of lies in getting organized, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Anything to add on this topic?
Well, I think the other day I was at a brand, and I think they had kind of the similar question in mind. Right? We want to actually connect. This is a corporate wear company, and they want to connect the people that are wearing the clothes with people that are actually making the clothes. And they are thinking about, okay, how can we make them communicate there? They're not there yet, but I think this is also to make sure that both sides of the equation here have a pride in it. So they were wearing a uniform for a specific company, and this is their daily life, and they need to be comfortable in that. At the same time, there's this person on the other side of the equation that is making an effort to make it look nice, have it high quality, and to see how can we connect those ends. It's something interesting. They weren't there yet, but it's underway.
I love hearing about this. As long as it's done respectfully towards people who make clothes, I think it's brilliant.
So just it's really a fascinating challenge, this communications piece and this connecting. I think that it's very clear that as humans, we love stories. There's the things that we've done for millennia is being able to tell stories. And so stories really resonate with us. Now, in this particular landscape, it's okay. We know that to be the case. That's why marketing is so good. We don't just pump numbers at people, but we turn a way to tell that into numbers, into stories. But how can we do this in a way that is respectful, that is responsible, but that also doesn't detract from what the things that you really need to do? And so there's this kind of important triangulation that needs to be done. And I think as an organization, we need to also experiment quite intensively with what we want to do. Not to sound too kind of business-like, but obviously with everything that we do, there has to be a business outcome. And so when we work on sustainability, we work on human rights, it's always trying to find the angle of how can this help us be more successful as a business. And then how can we take that opportunity to really translate that into storytelling in a way that resonates for our customers, because our customers have told us that they find this important. So to your point, a lot of our customers find value in this. They want values-based, purchases to be much more on their agenda. They want us to look at decent work agendas. They want us to be better in the supply chain. So how can we find a way to do that in a way that really connects and adds that value to the bottom line, as well as providing value to the workers that would then create a bit of a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that I always tell companies as well when talking about sustainability is it is people, planet, profit. And sometimes when companies don't mention that, that's when communications can also be disingenuous. You are a business, and that has to be considered. I am getting the wrap-up symbol flashed at me. So thank you to our speakers. That was a really fruitful discussion. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions on Slido. Apparently, we have a few more about the HRDD Academy itself. If you join me in less than an hour, we will be able to answer them and more, I'm sure, because there will also be a Q&A element of that section. But yes, to summarize what we've talked about, gosh, so many different things. How HRDD brings harmonization, how MSIs know both business and human rights and why they play such a key role. Accountability and celebration is what HRDD can bring. The importance of bringing together all those different stakeholders, not just the ones we usually talk about, also investors, regulators, trade unions. We talked a lot about audits, preventing them, making sure that companies can access those that have already been done rather than reinventing the wheel. The discrepancy in what you see in an audit versus having conversations with people that Suhasini mentioned. That the process will take time. It's about slow progress rather than perfection. The importance of social media, we touched on communications, avoiding greenwashing, values-based communications, the fact that European companies are being put under certain pressures that others aren't, and legislators need to know about this. And I will finish by saying collaboration is key. So it's almost time for the lunch break. I'm just going to let you know what's on the agenda after lunch. So as I mentioned, I'll be joined at 1 o'clock by Marietta van Amstel, Head of Membership at Fairware. She's going to present a demo of the HRDD Academy and discuss how it was designed by Fairware. And following this, there will be 4 deep dive sessions, which will take place one after the other from 1:30 till 3:30, which you can check on the programme. You are welcome to join for all the sessions or only dip in and out to those who want. And if you have any more questions specifically about the HRDD Academy and how this could work for your brand, we're offering one-to-one sessions this afternoon. So all you have to do is go to hrddacademy.com/launch and book your 20-minute session with one of our HRDD experts. You can also contact Fairware at any time through join@fairware.org. If you email them, they'll get back to you after today's event. Thank you again to our guests. Thank you again to our audience. See you after lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you.